Hey there YouTube. So this is going to be a video about how to repair the 9¼ inch limited slip gear on the rear end of a 99 Dodge Ram 1500. Okay, so here's the difficulty. The spider gears inside of here are all retained by this 5/8, roughly 5/8 or 3/4 inch bolt that goes through the, or it's a pin that goes through the center, and then there's a little tiny 5/16 head, 8mm head retainer bolt that threads into here, and then you get a smooth shank portion that goes right through and retains this pin from falling out. And the problem is these things break, and so I've drilled using a 1/8 long drill bit. You can see here it's quite long. Got a center punch hole on the broken piece of the threading that's in there. Drilled in about, I'd say about 3/8 to 1/2 of an inch, and then I tapped in this easy out and with a hammer, not really hard, but just enough to get a little wrench on it, and it's turning. So I'll finish working this out and I will continue from there. And clearance is an issue on this. If you'll notice when you look from the side how closely this lock pin bolt aligns with the case where the rear cover plate goes on. So I've removed the bearing cap on the side carrier to get a little bit more room here. It's probably a little easier to have the crown gear lined up this way a bit more so that you're working right off the center, but this works just fine when you're using a foot-long drill bit. I'm using an Irwin part number 62108, and it's a really long bit. They got them in numerous sizes, and they're very sharp. You don't have to push hard, but you do have to be careful when you're drilling that you don't drill off center or push too hard, otherwise this shank will snap. But the bit is so sharp, it does the work for you, so you don't have to worry about it. And so we've just about got this out. Okay, here it comes, and there it is. Now there's a couple different kinds of easy outs. I like these straight shanked ones. They work just fine, but as you can see, the smooth part, where is it here? The smooth part is right there, and there's just a little tiny bit of threads left over where the head broke off, but thankfully those threads kept it from flying apart, and the old bolt was threaded in. The head of the bolt that broke off was threaded in there anyways, so it can't fly apart. But this is a major issue with these. Ordering a Yukon Gear upgraded heavy-duty carrier with the new clutch pack for this Dodge Ram. It's a 99. As you can see in there, let's see if I can get a pointer in there. Right, you see this half circle here? Right there. There's a clutch pack in there that has little half circle, half moon notches in there that keep it from rotating, and it gives you limited slip, semi-locking rear end. Problem is, on this side of the clutch pack and on the back side of the clutch pack, the big heavy lock tabs, they break. They break off right here, and then those pieces end up down in the base here and get ground up into metal. That metal gets into your bearings, and then you get a nice howling sound. Now on this one, we've already removed the drive shaft, as you can see there, and we've removed the yoke, so we just have the shaft exposed here. We've already popped the seal out. And on this one, we're going to put a master kit in, which includes the side carrier bearings, the pinion shaft bearings, and the crush sleeve to give you the proper preload tension on the bearings. And so just the Yukon aftermarket upgraded gear and the master bearing kit will cover everything we need except for the axle seals inside the brake drums there on either end, and it doesn't come with those side axle bearings, although it's very rarely you see any damage done to the side bearings here. They're located inside there, and I'll show them to you later. So those bearings, you just have, once you pull the axles out, which is the first step to getting those axles out, is you got to get this lock bolt out like we just did, get this pin out, and then there's some C-lock washers in there. I'll show you. I don't know if you can see. I'll turn the flash on. Okay. So you can just see there's the big long bolt, the pin that goes right through the spider gears. This is the tip of the driver's side axle, and this one on this side is the tip of the passenger axle. And once you get this pin out and the wheels jacked up, you push the axles in a little bit, and that exposes the C-lock washers which you can pull out with the needle nose pliers and a magnet. So I'll get that pin out, and then I'll get back and show you some more. Okay, so I have the wheels blocked. It's up on axle stands, making sure that when you lift the axle stands up, that it firmly locks into the notch. I've seen more mechanics get crushed rib cages, broken arms, etc. from not making sure that these lock tabs are in place on the axle stands. Now this is a mobile road service call. This is my primary type of work. I do mobile diagnostics and repairs. But on this one, I've removed the drums. No problems with getting them off. They weren't rusted on. And so I've tapped the center pin right in here to push it through a little bit, so that a little bit is sticking out on this end so I can grab it. Now with the wheels off, I can rotate this very easily, grab the pin, and it comes right out just like that. Okay, so now that's done, set it aside and rotate the carrier till it's back. And you can see now that the pin is gone, the axle tips here are exposed. Now I'm just going to use my foot on this side to push the axle in, and you'll see the C-clip comes right out just like that. Okay, I just slid the axles out. Once I got the two C-locks out, just stand them up right next to the vehicle. And important to check right here where the bearings ride. Bearings ride here, seal rides here. New seals for sure, but make sure there's a pretty good reflection in here. If you're seeing kind of pit marks or scoring, just polish it up with some 320 grit, and do that on both sides. The axle seal right here pops out very easily using crowbar like so, and you just give it a little push like that, pops right out, and you can use a slide hammer attachment to pull outwards. It's got one little hook that hooks like that, and another hook that hooks like this, and then a sliding weight that bangs out and pulls out the bearing, and then it just taps in using the old bearing, or a big socket if you like, or a bushing driver set if you have that. So far these look okay. We're going to have a better look at them later. So I got both the axles out, and I got the other carrier side bearing cap off, as you can see right here. So they're both free and clear here. Got the pin out, C-locks out. Now the only thing holding it in is the tension on the side here and here. Okay, I've removed the carrier. There's a special trick on these Dodge. It's actually a brilliant idea. Inside the axle tube, there's this threaded nut. You can just see the threads there. Now this hollow part pushes on the bearing race here, which pushes on the side carrier bearing, and it makes it totally adjustable, the side tension, so you don't need to put shims in anymore. Now, the problem is the instructions call for a C4164 special tool, which is a tool that goes right through the axle tube housing, right there where the axle goes, and it has the teeth that lock into either the center here or on the notches on the outside edge. But there's this shortcut, so you don't have to go buy the tool. Now this threaded coupler, well, here's the empty housing there, you can see the pinion shaft. This threaded coupler is installed before the carrier goes in, and it threads in. They're clockwise threads, both sides, and you thread this in, and through the holes here you can just get a small screwdriver. I used a little flathead screwdriver. This is a little too big, but it goes through there, and you can start by prying on that to loosen it off counterclockwise, coming from this direction. So you turn that way for the left side, the driver's side, and you turn this way on the passenger side. And you keep loosening it, loosening it, loosening it until the axle pretty much falls out. Don't force it. And you have to remove these, clean up the threads. And this one, as you can see, it's still sticking out quite a ways. You can just see inside of there where the holes are. You can get a screwdriver into on those to tighten it or to loosen it. But this one has got a lot of metal in it, so it's going to have to be try chasing it with some penetrating oil and then working it all the way in to unthread it. Because once you go past a certain point, I don't know if it's going to fall into the axle tube, and then you'd be in real trouble trying to get it out. So now that I got this one completely unthreaded, like in that direction, so that it's past the edge of the threads here. The side carrier bearing was able to just come straight out like that, no problem. And then once I got the carrier out, then it's easy to unthread this one by hand because it's not all galled up with metal fragments from the broken tabs on the clutch pack. But this one's going to be a little bit of a problem. But if you're wondering where the howling can come from, here's the pinion shaft. Listen to this. You should be able to hear that on the microphone. It's got a really constant humming sound that increases with your vehicle speed. And so we're going to put a master kit with the crush sleeve and the bearings and races and shim for the pinion shaft, new carrier bearings and races for both sides, and some new seals, and polish the axles up because the outer bearings seem to be okay. And aside from that, we'll take the carrier, throw it away. We've got a new carrier coming. We've just got to save the ring gear, and there's about 14 bolts on it. It's going to come off, and we just bolt the 9 1/4 ring gear onto the new aftermarket bulletproof differential housing. So you get this whole thing when you order the upgraded kit, and you just change the ring gear. I'll show you here what it looks like. It comes with new spider gears, new clutches, everything. I don't think the bearings are installed on the housing, but that's easily done. You just take all these bolts off out here, and this whole ring gear will pop right off in that direction. And then we'll be ready to go and put it all back together. Okay, so we got the pinion shaft here. To get it out of the housing, you make sure the nut is fully threaded on. This is the nut that holds the yoke on. It holds the drive shaft rear U-joint. You make sure the nut is right flush with the tip of the shaft, and you use a brass or a lead hammer, leather mallet if you like, but I think usually you need a little bit more hit, because this bearing here is on that shaft, not pressed on, but it's on pretty tight, and to get it out you gotta hit it pretty hard. So you can hit with a block of wood against this and use a regular steel hammer. I used about a 3-pound hammer, and that was enough to get it out. And so when it comes out, what's left behind in the housing are these 2 races. You got this one for the larger bearing right here, and you have this one that is in the case for the smaller bearing. So the bearing comes off with the shaft, but the races are left behind, and then you just use a punch, about a 2-foot punch, and there's little notches cut away in the housing, so you can get the punch just on the inner edge here and on the inner edge here to hit here, 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 back and forth until it gets out, going forward towards the front of the truck to get the small one out. And to get the larger one out, same thing. You just put the punch through the housing where the yoke is on this end, run the punch in this way, and you'll also be able to catch the edges of the race right here and keep hitting back and forth. You can also use a bushing driver tool if you have that, and that'll get it out without having to go back and forth. It just bolts on directly, and you have a ledge tool that threads to the edge of the drift, and you just hit it straight on and it comes straight out. But I just used a punch because I was doing a roadside service. So what we're going to do is take off the crush sleeve. The bearing, let's see, the bearing goes on like this. The race is in the housing here, and so the crush sleeve is right up against this ledge right here, and it just slides right off. Sometimes you have to tap it a little bit or use a little heat if it's stuck on, and you get a new crush sleeve with the master bearing and seal set. And to get this one off, I have a tool right here. As you can see, it's got these two half moon shapes here and these adjuster bolts, and these little notches here go up against the back side of the bearing, and then you thread in this big rod here, goes in through there, and you have an adjusting nut here. This little machined tip here threads or centers right in the hole right there on the shaft, and I'll get that set up and show you how it works. Sometimes you have to cut the bearing cages off to expose the inner race that's pressed, actually it's the inner race that's pressed on, and these are just sort of floating. And if you cut that off with a grinder, bend it and break off the pieces, you'll be able to catch the little thin ledge right in here, right underneath this surface that you can see here. You can catch the edges of that tool on there and just pull it off directly that way. Alternatively, sometimes when you can't even get it off that way, you apply some heat to expand just on one edge here in a thin line up and down using a propane torch, and then use the tool to pull it off. And if that doesn't work, you can cut diagonally very carefully with a grinder, the most dangerous tool I've ever used. Not for me personally, but that's the general opinion of everyone I talk to. You talk about a skill saw being dangerous. Well, try using a grinder with a 1/16 thick cutoff wheel and see how things can go flying. And I've heard some stories. So that's the third way. You can cut one side there and one side there, and then use a chisel and split it off in two pieces. Okay, so we're all set up here. Got the tool all set up. Now I could have used the longer adapters here that bring up the shafts to about here, and then I can use intermediate shaft with the nut to adjust it. But in this case, since the nut is already on, there's already a nut on the pinion shaft on the bottom here, I'm all set up, so I don't need to use the extra long one that you would require these long shafts for. So I'm going to give this a try. Tighten up these. Not too much, just enough to dig into the little shallow ledge underneath there, and we'll give it some torque and try it out. We're all set up here and just tightening up these nuts. I can see the race moving up. I may actually run out of space. Yeah, getting there. So I got to back these off a bit. Retighten this now that it's closer down. Nope. Tighter there, a little tighter here. Okay, now this nut has to be, we've loosened this off, so this will go up. Lift up, get as much play here with leaving at least 1/4 of the fine thread nuts on this tool, and then loosen off this nut so it's closer to the tuning fork looking thing here. Okay, so that's tight. So that's taken up the shim here. Now that I've moved the bearing up about 1/4 of an inch, I've moved the nut up to take up the slack here. So now I can use these nuts to tighten it down again. Normally you wouldn't have to do this if you had the long arm attachments, but this is just a shortcut. and it's a really good idea to center it. Check your angles here. They usually go off center about 5 degrees. Everything looks good and centered now. A little bit on each side. Watch the bearing as you're adding tension. And we're in trouble again because we've run out of threads. Okay, so we got the, we didn't need to readjust. The bearing was 3/4 of the way off. I just held this part here while my assistant allowed him to drive it out with a mallet, and it came off no problem at all, so didn't need to reset. Granted, if you had the longer arms to attach it, you could probably do it without having to mess around with the extra steps, but all that works as well. So now these bolts that you have to take off, they're left-hand threads, so you set your gun to tightening, so don't make that mistake. And you just put 2 bolts in it, hammer down onto the bolts there and there, back and forth, and it'll knock the carrier, the ring gear off the carrier. Okay, this is the setup we have for pulling out the axle bearings. There's the 2 teeth in there. They have hooks that hook around the back side of the bearing there. And you tighten it up till it's stiff enough to hold its own weight right here. And I have, this isn't a traditional slide hammer, it's just in a way I adapted the puller set I had. Give you a heavy enough slider weight to hit like that. You need to use 2 hands on this one and possibly a little bit of heat, so I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. I'm going to try hitting it a few times and see how well it starts to come apart. This is a bit of a shortcut to get the new carrier bearings that come in the master kit, as you can see here. I've already removed the side carrier bearings and matched them up to make sure I got the right ones. And they mount with the taper going that way. If you put it in backwards, you're going to be pulling it off and buying a new pair of carrier bearings. So now you can do 2 things. You can either put it on with a shop press, which I don't have because I'm on the road, or you can sweat them on. You can either put them into an oven at around 300 degrees for 15 minutes or so. It's already been preheated, or you can very carefully apply a little bit of heat with a propane torch to the inside race. Not too much heat, just for a minute or so after the sweat comes out of the metal. You rotate it every once in a while, doing this one-handed, and you just evenly apply the heat. You don't want to take the temper out of the bearing race, but this is enough to expand the metal all the way around and make the diameter a thou or 2 wider just by expansion, and it'll slide right onto the carrier. Now the carrier is currently at about 45, 50 Fahrenheit, so it's quite cold out. Not freezing cold, but if you can put it in the freezer for half an hour beforehand, it'll help. It'll cool it down quite a bit, and as long as you get the bearing on quick, you have a hot bearing race and you have a cold shaft that it's pressing onto. It should slide right on, or just light taps with a hammer if you're very careful, making sure you don't get it started at an odd angle. You can get the whole bearing on in no time flat. So just about there. Since I'm doing it one-handed, I can't keep the heat completely continuous, but I'll just keep rotating it and we'll get there. I've done this for transmissions, and it's easier for installing. It's not so easy to do it to remove it, especially if you get a propane torch, but it can be done. The puller tools for removing are pretty much necessary. You can't really get around them, except for where I was showing you earlier about cutting the outer bearing cage off here and then grinding the race at a 45 without grinding into the base that it's pressed onto. That's very difficult to do without lots of experience, so I don't suggest beginner mechanics to try that. especially if they haven't got any experience using a grinder. You should be working on stuff on jobs that don't matter as much when you first start using a grinder. So any mistakes aren't, you can redo them just on say just a home welding job. You're not looking for anything special. But when it comes to a client's equipment, you don't want to be grinding into the shaft that these bearings are pressed onto, because otherwise you're weakening it. You know, thousandths or two isn't a big deal, but I've seen some guys do some pretty bad hatchet jobs with their grinders before, so it takes some experience. So I can feel it now through my gloves here that it's quite hot, and I'm going to put it on real quick here. If I can't get it on by hand, showing you with the camera, I'm going to have to tap it. Very careful you don't hit the cage, because that will be a problem. You warp that cage and you're up the creek without a paddle, as it were. Okay, I'm going to have to grab my drift and finish this. Okay, this is an alternate setup. If you've already taken the carrier out and removed the races, you'll notice that the smaller bearing race for the pinion bearing, this is the old one, which you have to save all the bearing races for driving in the new races if you don't have a bushing driver set. This, when you put the wide edge, not the narrow edge, but the wide edge here up against here, you'll find it's just about 1/8 of an inch wider in diameter. Now I only had a couple minutes to do this. It would have been better if I'd been set up right away, but I was trying to show you with the camera. Now this, of course, could be anything. You could use a block of wood, although wood is good for the base for taking the load when you're driving on with a hammer when you've still got some heat in there. Every second that you leave it on that shaft, that heat is being soaked into the shaft and it's equalizing and it's tightening up. So I quickly set down the camera, found this race was perfect, and set this on the ground, and 3 or 4 drifts later with a just a 2-pound ball peen hammer. Now it's horrendously noisy, as you can hear, because this is technically like a tuning fork. So probably woke up the neighbors. Anyway, so now I've already made sure that it's fully bottomed out. Shoulders fully bottomed out right in here up against the shoulder. Can't fit a feeler gauge in there. You want to make sure you push it on all the way, otherwise when you preload it with those adjuster nuts I was showing you earlier, it'll feel fine, and the longer it rides it'll actually loosen up in there. So you got to make sure it's fully on. And so now I'm going to flip it over and do the other side and get that on, give it a quick cleaning, and then we'll be ready to put the pinion shaft in and set the find the shim thickness that we're going to need and go from there. Okay, so I got the second one on, heated it up just a little bit more, focusing more heat on the thicker end of the race that this cage is on, because that needs more expanding than the thin end, and it went on with 2 taps after that. Now when you're using a hammer, I suggest only if you've been doing this for a very, very long time that you do that. And I suggest if you have a shop press, use a shop press. I'm beside the highway here. We're not in a good position here to tow the vehicle. My shop is much too far away, and I do all my servicing on the road anyways. So the method I'm using, you got to be very, very steady in how you do it. And when the whatever heavy metal shim you're putting on top of the bearing race that you're using in this case to push on the shell but not the cage, you got to make sure it's not actually touching the cage at the same time. Otherwise you got to find something that's just the right size, and you got to know if it's strong enough, if it's going to fall off, go sideways on you and then nick the cage. To be sure, when you're all finished, use some air and blow off the bearings, and then try one of the new races on there And while you're pushing, feel for any rumbling. Make sure that you're pushing hard enough because it's dry right now. You put some oil on there and that's sort of defeating the test. If it's completely all cleaned off and there's no grit in there from anything, you won't feel anything. It'll feel nice and smooth as you're running the race on it. And I've already done that on both sides and they're perfect. And this one's right butted up against the base of the carrier here. So now I'm going to put the crown gear on, and then I'm going to focus on the pinion shaft. I've put the ring gear on from underneath, and don't forget these are left-hand thread bolts, so left tightens it. And I've got the old bolts here. I wasn't sure if it came in a master kit, but they do. And on this model, this 9 1/4 inch, these are all perfectly lined up. You can put the gear on whichever way, but make sure you start them all by hand. Start two by hand, opposing each other, just to hold the weight, and then start all these by hand before you start tightening any down. And don't just start tightening down one all the way and then go to the next one and to the next one. You got to actually tighten them up just snug, a little bit at a time, using a cross pattern like you would be doing for tightening down head bolts, to make sure that while you're watching it, as you're tightening it, that the gap in here is taking up evenly and it's not catching on anything. And get that snug down before we start torquing them down. Okay, so it took 10 hits with the slide hammer on each side to get the bearings out, and now I've chased the holes with brake cleaner. I've got 4 cans just to make sure, and there's likely metal sludge still in there, even though it looks nice and clean, and that's just damp brake cleaner on the bottom. When you're doing it, you're going to have a pool along the bottom, and you keep triggering the spray along the bottom, swishing back and left and right to push all the fluid and sludge that way, so that you're just left with a little bit in there. And when you're ready to go, just use a long, you could use a piece of a hockey stick, broom handle, whatever, and tape a rag onto it. Not a paper one that leaves any lint, just an old t-shirt, etc., and work it in and out of there to make sure, and give it some extra brake cleaner to make sure everything's all nice and wet, and then work it in there to get any traces of metal sludge out of there. And then when you finish with that, chase it with air. So I'm going to go do that right now, and then we're going to get the rest of it together. I'll show you real quick also here. When you torque these down, you got to make sure you get the right torque specs. This one, for a 9 1/4 inch Chrysler, it takes 65 foot-pounds of torque, and so I don't have a vise here on the road, so I very, very carefully set the gear with a crowbar in like that, being very careful not to damage the springs, and then slowly rotated, having the bar in just at an angle like that, slowly rotate. Hold the gear on top and the bar at the same time while I was torquing with the torque wrench. And I'm not using the clicker style, just the regular sweet bar torque wrench. You can see here, sort of. And you go back and forth by hand first, in little increments until you get it fully bottomed out in here. And then when you start torquing, you can do a few cross back to back, and then you can just go in a clockwise pattern starting at 12 o'clock and then working all the way around back to here, and then go around one more time, because you'll always find 2 or 3 that'll take a little bit more. And that's the same with head gasket bolts. You always go over the pattern again to make absolutely sure there's nothing loosened up, and gives you a little bit more to make sure that your job is perfect. If it's not perfect, you shouldn't be a mechanic. You got to do it right. Granted, you know, using a hammer instead of press on this is not perfect, but I'm limited by being on the road, and packing a shop press in my vehicle is not an easy thing to do. So, when in doubt, just take it into a shop and have them press the bearings on. They've got all the equipment, the adapters and everything. If you don't want to risk trying what I did, and as it was, everything turned out just fine. But I've been doing this for a very long time, and usually I suggest new mechanics or mechanics that haven't got that much experience pressing bearings on, take it into a shop and have them press it. If you've got your own press at home, so much the better. And you can keep old races around, because these are really good for all kinds of scenarios when you're pressing or pulling, and especially when you're installing new races. Like I have two brand new races here. Now these are the side carrier bearings, so they don't require tapping them into the case. They just go over the bearing caps and then it presses in, and then you thread those adjusters on. But in the case where you're installing the races into the housing where this goes, you use the old bearing race up against the new bearing race. You use the well, the bearing race always goes the thicker end into the housing first, that way, and then you take the new bearing in the exact same alignment and step it up above it and tap that in. If you don't have a bushing driver, you can tap it in very carefully. You can find a shim that'll work perfectly and get it started into the case. I don't suggest you use any heat, because it would take you forever to heat up the case, and you wouldn't want to warp that case, get anything out of alignment, because you would need a lot of heat to make this drop in. In this case, these things are so strong, driving them in is, I mean, it's very hard to nick the surface of this very, very high hardened steel. So anyways, I'll show you how to do that when I get to that point. Okay, now I've polished the axles with, actually I had no 320 grit, so I used 280 grit. And you can see, if this thing will bloody focus, it's pretty good. There's a few little tiny pits. You can just see them there. Now, the whole width of the bearing is this far, and these are inward pits, not outer. I've already made sure of that. So the seal surface is going to be good, and the bearing surface is going to be bearing on 99% of the bearing surface. So this will just hold oil. The only problem could come later if there's any metal starts coming apart inside the differential, and it gets in the down the axle tubes and gets into here. Then it can it has somewhere to stay, but that's the best we can do without buying a whole set of axles, and the client just doesn't want to go any more investment into this. So these are, it's troubling. I'd rather have it absolutely perfectly polished, but the more you take off of these, the more gap you have between the bearing and the surface. So we're going to leave it like that, and it's really easy to put the sandpaper, or fold it 3 or 4 times here, spray penetrating oil. I use Seafoam Deep Creep. It's one of the best penetrating oils I've ever used, and you just lay it on there, and then use your right hand and rotate the axle like that while you're holding here, and it takes no time. Clean it all up with brake cleaner, a rag, and compressed air until it's absolutely whistle clean. Don't forget to do the splines here, because that's where most of the metal is, and then you'll end up with a perfectly clean axle ready to go in when you're ready to go. You can give it a quick blast of air when you're all finished, just to make sure no dust is on there. And now on the shims here for the pinion, the original shim is designed differently. It has these little notch tabs, you can see there. It's 27 thou thick. You measure it all the way around different sections of the washer to get an average. You might get a 1 or 2 or 3 thou variants. Sometimes 3 thou variants, you may not be able to get an accurate reading anywhere by averaging it out, but you do your best to average it out, and I got 26 to 27 thou, so I went with 27 thou replacement shims. There's 2 of them here, different design, but they're a little wider bearing surface, so they go on first before the bearing goes on, like so. And then this is the bearing is 2 thou tighter than the surface that it presses onto. It's normal. You're going to have some tension on there. Now, to make absolutely sure I don't have any high spots, I also did the same trick with the sandpaper on this. and on this, because this is the large bearing surface where the pinion bearing goes on there, and this is the smaller bearing towards the front where the yoke bolts on here. So make sure these are polished absolutely perfect, and then do a visual inspection when you're all finished cleaning it up. Now, as for underneath, for the bearing races that go into the housing for the pinion shaft, the race here, I started by hand, just tapped it with a long heavy punch. I have one here that's quite heavy duty. It's quite a large punch, but it's got a nice square face on it. A little bit of a chamfer at the edge there, but so you just tap that in a little bit on one side, then the other side, keep working it around, and then go in threes, and then divide it by fives, and just keep working around, making sure it's going in evenly. Keep measuring if you need to, using a you can use a stick, you can use a pencil, you can use a rule, whatever you want. Whatever you use, you just put your finger on the edge of it and then just push it around the edge of the bearing as it's going in, and looking for high spots or low spots, or you can just use your hands and feel around the bearing shell as it's going in to make sure you're putting it in evenly, because it's not so bad if it's a little bit off center when you first start, but the further you go in, the more off center you are. You can break this very easily. Well, not that easily, but you can break it, and you can also damage the bore. So it's very important that you make sure it's going in evenly, especially after the first quarter of insertion. And once you get to the last little bit, in some cases when you're installing these, you would use an old bearing, butt it up against it with a thick edge going that way, just like the new bearing is, so that you have a ledge on the back side here that you can insert a punch in from the front end and knock out the old bearing shell. But in this case, this thing bottoms out within a 1/16 of an inch of the edge of the tapered bore here. So I was able to use the punch going around 3 to 5 times all the way around with the punch right up against the edge, being very careful not to skip and miss. It gets quite heavy holding it, especially when you're holding a ball peen at the same time to keep hitting the punch. But if you're very slow, careful, and accurate, you can get this thing in perfectly, and you listen to it. It makes a totally different sound once the race bottoms into the bore. It doesn't ring so much. It sounds more like a dead blow. So just keep an ear out for that while you're doing it. And so we're gonna finish getting the pinion shaft ready and the carrier to go in for a dry fit, and see what the contact pattern is using that special compound they have for checking the contact pattern of the crown and pinion between the pinion and the crown teeth. And the instructions are very clear on how to do that. Also, I filed the galled up threads on the adjuster nut that goes in here for the pushing against the side race. And I'm going to chase this with a 90-degree O-ring pick to make sure there's no heavy parts in here. I may have to do a bit of finicky work in here to take out any large chunks that are preventing this thread from being nice and clean, but the nut had a lot of galling on it, so that covered that mostly. Okay, just in a quick tip here, the kind of file you use for chasing threads is this style. It's very sharp angle. You can see it there. It's not focusing very well, but it's quite a sharp angle. Now, you can't use a 3-corner file on these because it's fine thread. 3-corner file would be okay on large coarse thread bolts, for example, but in this case you need this special type of file, and you got to follow along, starting at a good section and being very careful to keep rotating while you're filing, and keep inspecting your work, cleaning it off with air, and especially when you get to the last little bit where the threads start or end, you got to follow along the good side that you've already been chasing along until you get to the very last groove where the actual thread starts, and make sure you don't make a double groove by being lazy. You got to go very slow and careful and be very cautious. And I've got all the galling off of this. It was looking really bad towards the end here. This is the nut on the passenger side that I couldn't get to completely release, and the one on the other side I'm going to inspect as well. But this was the most difficult one. And don't forget too, where you're using the screwdriver through the gasket surface of the rear cover plate. When it got really tight, it was having to use a hammer on it, and it put a lot of galling here and raised up material. So I used a flat file and filed all the way around on all of these, and then a round file, a chainsaw file, right through the center here to get any little high pieces off here. So while you're using it, you don't have any problems with metal being dislodged later on. Okay, so I heated up the bearing with the propane torch a little bit longer than the other one than the ones I installed onto the Carrier, and that 2 thou difference was nothing to a good consistent about 400 degrees. If you want, you can use a you can go about 325, 350 or whatever, but you can use a laser temperature pointer reader. They're cheap ones, come on sale once in a while for around $40, and you can, after you remove the heat, you can just check it in a couple spots to see what temperature it's at. With these nitrile gloves, just holding it for just like that long was, well, yeah, about that long, about a quarter of a second, was a little bit too hot. So I just managed to pick it up where I was heating it on this metal bar here. I was able to pick it up, get it on there, and it just slid right on and started to cool down. Then I chased it with some air. And one thing to be very careful of is once it cools down and pinches onto the shaft, you'll find that when you look through where the shim, between the back edge of the bearing and the edge of the shim, and you look it up, hold it up to the light, you'll be able to see a big gap. It'll actually, even though you just dropped it on there, it was too hot to put any tension on it. So when I was finished, I used this. I just moved it around in 1/5 of a arc at a time, and kept tapping it down until I got that dead blow sound I was explaining about for the bearing race that matches this bearing, and checked it up against the light after I went around a couple more times just to make sure, and there's no light in there at all. So this is fully pushed up against the shims now. So just dropping it on there isn't enough. Don't forget to tap it on the rest of the way, and now I'm going to dry fit it. Okay, I wanted to show you underneath here. Now I got the crush sleeve in there. There's 2 came in the kit, the master kit. Now, normally I don't do the this type of job very often, and I really don't feel like having to pull those bang the shaft out of the smaller bearing, the one that goes towards the front of the housing, right there. Now I got a new crush sleeve on before I heated up the bearing and slid it over the shaft. I had an assistant hold the pinion gear into the housing there after I got the race in and everything. It's all pre-oiled up and everything. Now the crush sleeve takes a lot of torque. You either use a 3/4 inch air impact, which I don't have with me, or you can think out of the box. I got a 2x6 there and a 2x4, and I got a crescent wrench, or a pipe wrench, holding on to the yoke. Let's see if I can zoom in. Oh, I guess I can't zoom in. But you'll see I got the crescent wrench holding right there, and I got my 3/4 inch ratchet. Now I tightened it up by hand as far as I could go, and then I required a jack to get the rest of the way. Now I've been going up. I can get 2 notches on the ratchet out of every cycle of jacking up the floor jack. This is just a small floor jack. You have to be careful doing this because once you give it too much torque, your crush sleeve is beyond. You have to try a few cycles, watch the yoke as you're jacking up and tightening the ratchet, and if you don't watch and listen and feel and disconnect it every 4 cycles or so, and then check to see how much play, you'll feel the yoke moving like this and in and out, knowing that crush sleeve is taking a while to get to the position it needs to be, because there's a very specific torque you have to have preload on that bearing. So It's going to take a little while, but there is an actual attachment you can mount onto the yoke there that holds onto the bell housing, so or the differential housing, so you don't actually have to use a pipe wrench. And but this is just thinking out of the box. I mean, I'm on a roadside service call, not in ultra clean conditions. You really got to think out of the box sometimes on what to do. And so this is working just fine. The pipe wrench is holding nice and rock solid, and because it's wood, the end of the handle right there is biting into the wood, so whenever I loosen off the jack to get another 2 notches out of the ratchet, that pipe wrench is not moving. As long as you got the angle right, it's almost, I'd say, 15 degrees off of vertical, and that's what's helping it bite in. Any less shims underneath that, and it would just come this way and swing right over. So this is just a little bit of a hint of what you can do when you don't have the right tools, and you don't want to rent all the right tools. So I mean, you can take it into a rear end shop and pay $3,000 or $4,000 or whatever to have it rebuilt. Or one of the reasons why I'm actually rebuilding this rear end instead of actually buying a used axle is because these axles are very hard to find that haven't already been wrecked. Almost every one I found was only being sold for parts, and they wanted $1,150 for a rear end that wasn't actually in good shape. So it totally justified buying the upgraded carrier unit, the DuraGrip from Yukon Gear, and rebuilding it. So I mean, why? Sometimes you got to bite the bullet and go a little bit further. I mean, if this is your own vehicle, you may not care. You put a used one that's got some damage to it, makes some noise, but it works. Some people might like to do that, but this is a client, and he wants this thing to run for a very, very long time. Yeah, it's an older vehicle. It's about 16 years old now, or 14 years old. But he's maintained it very well, and he wants this thing to be working properly. So this is why we're going to all the trouble of doing this. And I could have taken it into the shop and put it on the hoist and gone through all that, but it ties up a bay, and I've had other appointments that I do during the mornings, and then I finish up the rest of my day coming out here to pick at this job and get it done piecemeal. So it's just about done. But once I got the preload set, I can check the contact patch, and the carrier's all cleaned and ready to install. Everything's oiled up. The nuts are installed. They went in with a little bit of a fight, but a lot better than they came out. And so we'll come back when we get to the next step. Okay, so here's the crush sleeve. This is the second one that came in the kit. As you can see, it's got this bulbous shape in the center that allows it to slowly compress while it pushes out the centerpiece and makes this thicker looking pipe. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick pipe, shorter in height, so over time you can keep adjusting the tension on the carrier bearing. Now, when I was using the jack, you can use a pipe. You've got a long enough, heavy enough pipe, it's more accurate. You can exactly feel what's going on, whereas with an impact you can't hear anything, or you can't feel anything. And so when I was jacking on the jack handle, I had my hand up right close on the pipe so that I could feel any difference in torque. So while I was jacking up, I could feel there was a difference, so I stopped, took the pipe wrench off and the ratchet, and I could feel that all the play had been taken up, and there wasn't hardly any resistance at all. So it's not quite tight enough for running, but it's tight enough for a test, because once the play is taken out, that's good enough. And then you use an inch-pound torque wrench to check the preload before installation. And I don't have the seal on there or anything yet, so, and I've got another crush sleeve in case I screwed up on the first one here. So at any rate, so now I can install the carrier, which is all ready to go here. Just got to oil up the bearings here just a little bit and put the gear marking compound after this is installed into place, and then I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so it's getting pretty late here. I'm going to wrap up for the day. But the tricky part is done. I have about 10 thou play contact between the pinion and the crown gear by adjusting this nut and this nut to shim the carrier left to right, and not fully torquing down these. Like I torqued them down fully first in back and forth, and then loosened them off a little bit to get the shims to work. And so it's very close. Now, one other thing I didn't mention earlier is when you're taking this apart, use a punch to put 2 dots on the top of this bearing cap and on the housing, and 1 dot on this one and 1 on the housing, or vice versa, whatever way, so you know you get the right bearing cap up the proper way when you reinstall it. There's some clips that bolt in here and here, but they don't have to go on right now. I don't even have the axles in or anything. It's just the only thing that's oiled up is the bearings on the pinion shaft and on the carrier. That's it. I didn't put any oil in here yet because we're just getting the rough setup. So I'll come back tomorrow and we'll do the final adjustments and go from there. Okay, so I got my backlash between the teeth of the ring gear and the pinion gear set just maybe a thou bigger gap than recommended, and I didn't want to keep readjusting that. So now I've got some gear marking compound I put on here. Marked it on 2 or 3 teeth, and then turned the whole gear 90 degrees or 180 degrees, and then put it on 2 or 3 more teeth. And if you have a look at the contact pattern, you see where the gear marking compound's been wiped away there. You can see the gear underneath. That is the coast side you're looking at right there, and there and there. It's a little bit towards the valley and towards the outer end. Now if you look at the drive side, it's a little harder to tell with the camera, but it's mostly towards the base right here and towards the outer end. Now if you look at your instruction book, you'll see, let me just pull out of here, you'll see that that's not quite acceptable. And here I've left it open on the page. Now under acceptable patterns, you can see there's different contact points, but the pattern that I'm getting here is the pinion gear is too close. It's basically this one. You can see on the drive side right here, it's towards the base and more towards this end, and on the coast side it's got this pattern right here. That's pinion too close. Now it says to make big adjustments before you start making small adjustments, and you're never going to get it perfect. As long as you got an acceptable pattern that matches something on one of these 6 pictograms on the acceptable patterns page, then you're good to go. So now it says to go, where are we here, when making adjustments to used gear sets, because this is what we're dealing with here, or no, on used gear sets, it says to carefully to concentrate only on the pattern created on the coast side of the ring gear teeth. You can pay attention on the drive side, but it's the coast side that matters mostly. And when you're adjusting the pinion depth, you make large adjustments like 5 to 15 thou. Now because we're too close, we're going to have to take maybe 10 or 15 thou shims out. I think I got a 12 thou shim in there. I'll pull that one out, put it all back together again, and then we'll recheck our pattern. And hopefully we can get it in one shot. Okay, so here's the deal. I actually didn't have enough torque to get my inch to inch and or foot to foot and a half pounds of torque of preload. You put a torque wrench on the pinion nut over by the yoke there. You can just see it there. And if you get a foot to a foot and a half pound, or 12 to 16 pounds or inch pounds of torque, then you got the proper preload. Now because I put a new crush sleeve in there, that's not normally what you do, but if you look at the contact pattern on the drive side and the coast side is totally changed. I didn't have to apply, I just applied a little tiny bit more gear marking compound and it redistributed. You rotate the ring gear, you do not rotate the pinion shaft when you're checking your contact patterns, but you'll see that my coast side, which you're looking at right now at that angle, it's very well centered. It's not out towards the outside edge anymore. And just having that extra little bit, a few thou tightness on the bearings made a huge difference for the contact pattern. Now I got 8 thou backlash here. I've retorqued everything down, and when you one good rule of thumb, I just checked with the Yukon Gear supplier. They're also a rebuild shop. They said when you put 2 fingers or 3 fingers on this, you know, laying up front, laying over here, and getting your your dominant hand on it, and you can rotate it with 2 or 3 fingers without doing a gorilla grip grunt to get it to turn. If you can do that with 2 or 3 fingers, you got the proper bearing preload. But if you've got to really kind of grip it with your hand to get it to turn, you're too tight. Now, of course, you can see that this just a light touch on the carrier here rotates the carrier back and forth. I got the proper tightness on the nuts in here, and these are torqued down to 75 foot-pounds according to spec, and so there's no resistance here with the crown gear installed, but you'll get the exact same measurements without the carrier installed anyways. And it's not supposed to spin. When you let it go, it stops. So this is very important to remember for future installations. So there you go. I lucked out. Very first time, went with the exact same shim thickness that came out stock in behind the larger bearing, right in behind the pinion gear. I replaced it with brand new 27 thou shims. 2 of them made up 27 thou. And I put a new crush sleeve in. Because there was 2 in the kit, I just figured I'd try it. But sometimes you luck out, not always. But if after double checking my preload, if it wasn't quite right contact pattern, especially on the coast side for a used gear, the drive side's not really that critical, because that's pretty much drives very well all the time or makes good contact pattern on the used gears. But it's the coast side that really matters, and as you can see, it's virtually centered. And when you check the pictogram on the instructions, you'll find that that's a perfect pattern. So if it wasn't perfect, I would have had to grit my teeth, pull this thing out again, pull the pinion shaft or the yoke off, and drive out the pinion shaft and pull the bearing off the base, change the shim thicknesses, and go all over again. And that's one of the things that's annoying about doing rear ends. You can't get it right the first time usually. I just lucked out today. So I do admit that I was being a little bit lazy, thinking, okay, no, it's good enough, and no, I'll double check my pinion bearing preload. It might make a difference, and it did. It made a huge difference on the coast side. And the coast side is the concave. It's shaped like this. If you look on the diagram, well, if you look at the edges of the teeth, you see how they're shaped there, and you look at exactly how they're shaped. Coast side is right here where my finger is, and the drive side is right here. It's convex and concave on the coast side, and the coast side's perfect. So make sure you don't be lazy. If you're gonna put a rear end together that you want to last forever, get all these settings right, and don't take any shortcuts. And when in doubt, don't just assemble it thinking it's okay. You can walk into a gear shop, bring some video and show them what's going on, or you can contact someone and tell them exactly what's going on, what trouble you're having. But the major thing is you set up this nut on this side as close as you can get, and then you tighten it on this side, the right hand side, and then once you retighten that nut down, you tighten these bolts the last quarter of a turn, because you tighten them down evenly when you're putting the carrier in, and you put them, you torque them down until they're fully bottomed out, and then you back each one off of about a quarter of a turn so that these nuts through here will turn. And when you're tightening up this nut for the final assembly, You got to tighten that up to 75 foot-pounds before you tighten up the last little bit, 75 foot-pounds torque on the cap bolts. If you try to tighten this up when these cap bolts are tight, it's not going to move that race, and you're going to get slop down the road, and then you're going to have the carrier moving around left to right. So that's not good at all, and you're going to get gear noise. So we're going to clean up all this marking compound, give it a final clean. I'm going to pull the yoke off, install the seal, and we'll be ready to go and get the axles in. And then we got to do the wheel cylinders, but I won't need to show you how to do that, not in this video anyways.